Hi, my name is Tim Zarillo, and I want to talk to you a little bit about traumatic brain injury today. As many of you know from watching my videos, I am not a doctor and I don't pretend to be one. I'm in fact a lawyer who practices in Maine, so please don't take this video to be any sort of medical advice or any sort of legal advice. To give legal advice, I really need to understand the facts and circumstances of your case. The internet is a wonderful thing where you can get all sorts of information, but you really need to get specific medical advice to deal with any sort of brain injury you have, and specific legal advice to deal with your case. And if you are in the state of Maine, then I'm happy to give you that advice to the extent that I can. Traumatic brain injury is something that's very interesting, and I'm not going to give any sort of dissertation here. However, I do occasionally, and sometimes more than occasionally, run into cases where I question whether there has been a brain injury specific to an auto accident or some other accident or injury. When there's a traumatic brain injury, the brain sits inside the skull, floating in fluid, in essence. And inside of the skull, we have bony ridges that are sometimes sharp and hard on the inside of the skull. When there is a sudden acceleration or deceleration injury, like in an auto accident that's violent, sometimes that can cause the head to snap forward, and the brain remains floating in that liquid, and then can smash, for lack of a better word, against those bony ridges inside the skull. These are what they call contre-coup injuries. It's a French term. And these contre-coup injuries can create all sorts of different problems for people throughout the course of the rest of their lives, frankly. They can be mild. You can get post-concussion syndrome and that sort of thing. It can be concussion injuries, or they can be more dramatic. A couple of the different types of injuries you may have, and I want to focus on a few today, is a diffuse axonal injury. That is an injury not located to a particular area of the brain. That's a rapid acceleration, deceleration injury, and essentially the nerve cells are stretching during a diffuse axonal injury, and they compress over and over, and there's an injury to the brain during the time that those nerve cells are stretched. Focal contusions, that's a sliding impact of the brain on the skull. The temporal, the frontal lobes, if I recall, and the temporal lobes are the most susceptible to that sort of focal contusion, and it also can create problems with both cognitive problems and issues with emotional control. I've had a number of these focal contusions in which a seemingly normal, pleasant person all of a sudden, its family, his or her family reports to me, has become, very angry, very prone to fits of rage, that sort of thing, which wasn't ordinarily in their personality. A skull fracture, that's sort of obvious. If there is a skull fracture, there's likely a very significant impact that has occurred, and the skull has actually been fractured, and usually that is only in very large impact accidents. As are lacerations that are caused by skull fractures. Usually there's a fracture of the skull, but also the brain itself can become lacerated, meaning cut on those bony ridges that are inside of the skull. So when you're dealing with the brain, there are a variety of different issues involved, and it can become very dangerous from a plaintiff's perspective, because sometimes it's difficult to understand or to explain to an insurance adjuster the actual extent of the injury. It doesn't show up often. Some of the laceration, for example, would show up on a scan, but not a concussion may or may not, and many injuries to the brain may or may not show up in objective testing. As a result, you have to be careful. If you suspect a head injury, first you've got to, and specifically traumatic brain injury that we're dealing with here today, then you have to really get yourself in the hands of a very qualified neurologist. And if you don't know who to call, I'd be happy to give you some names. But if you've suffered any of these injuries through no fault of your own, through somebody else's fault, then I'm happy to talk to you about the legal ramifications of presenting claims for your damages and your injuries. So anyway, that's a brief little lesson on traumatic brain injury, for what it's worth, from a lawyer, not a doctor, but just from someone who deals with these cases and presents claims on behalf of injured people who have suffered traumatic brain injury in Maine. If you have any questions, you can always contact me, and I urge you to do so. My phone number is 207-347-6063, 207-347-6063. You can email me, tim@getzerillo.com. So that's tim@getzerillo.com. And www.getzerillo.com is also our website. And again, Zerillo is spelled Z like zebra, Erillo. I hope you found this helpful. I look forward to talking to you soon.